Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 9th live office hour for the MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'm Carl Bruch, and I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm here with Silja Halle. Silja is a guest lecturer for the course. Silja is a program officer with the Environment's Crisis Management Branch. She's also the program manager for the joint program on promoting gender-responsive approaches to natural resource management for peacebuilding, which is a partnership between UN Environment, UN Development Program, UN Women, and the UN Peacebuilding Support Office. Silja joined what was then the Post-Conflict and Disaster Management Branch in 2006, and she's held several roles within the branch, including as Deputy Subprogram Coordinator for Disasters and Conflict. Prior to joining the branch, Silja worked for the Geneva Environment Network, a cooperative partnership of environment and sustainable development organizations. She holds bachelor's and master's of arts degrees in humanities from the University of Geneva. Today, we'll be answering a mix of questions, some that were submitted by students ahead and some that we are receiving from you live. We'll do our best to get through all of them. If you run on promoting gender-responsive approaches to natural resource management for peace building. I gather I'm cutting out. Silja, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. So I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit more about the program on promoting gender-responsive approaches to natural resource management for peace building.
Sure. Thank you, Carl, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be online with you all today and to be able to discuss the topic of gender, natural resources, and peace. So the joint program that I manage was really born out of a realization that a number of organizations had collectively back in 2011, 2012, where we realized that on the side of UN Environment, where I work, we had by then done quite a lot of work on the nexus of environment, natural resources, conflict, and peace. We were beginning to understand quite well what those linkages were across various sectors, but we really hadn't looked at any of the kind of what we call the gender dimensions of that work. And conversely, by that point, following the adoption of Resolution 1325 in the Security Council, which was in the year 2000, there had been over 10 years of research and policy making in the field of women, peace, and security, or gender, peace, and security, but none of that work had really looked at how natural resources played into that area of expertise and how we could use natural resources and environment as opportunities or entry points for empowering women and peace building. So the organizations that comprise the partnership that we still have today came together for joint analysis of how these areas of work interlinked across various sectors, whether that's renewable resources, extractive resources, land, etc. And then to propose various strategies for using these entry points provided by environment and natural resources to strengthen women's roles in peace building. And that was a report that came out in 2013. And as I said, the joint program was born out of that, because after we published the report, we decided to continue the partnership in order to test some of the strategies that we had proposed in the report and look at different kinds of approaches for empowering women through natural resources and environmental interventions in peace building processes. So that's what we've been doing for the last few years. The program is really focused on field-based work and sort of field-based testing of various approaches. We've had a pilot project in North Kordofan in Sudan, which was completed in October of last year, and we have another pilot project ongoing in Colombia. And we'll be starting another intervention this year in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So that's really what the program is about. We're looking to learn from the pilot projects to understand what works and what doesn't, to understand a little bit more about how to measure success in this area, and we'll be putting all of that together, or we are putting all of that together in program guidance and training and other tools, including a knowledge platform that we've set up to help practitioners and researchers and policymakers understand how to deal with these issues and systematize those approaches within peace and development programming. So that's really what the joint program is about, and we're very happy to be in our third year of operation now, and looking forward to doing more in this area.
Silja, I was wondering, you've been working on these issues for a while now, and if you could talk a little bit about how the policy and how the understanding has evolved over that time.
Sure, the policy around specifically this nexus of gender, natural resources, and peace?
Exactly.
I would say, I mean, the policy framework is just beginning to move now, to shift a little bit. And I mean, partly, hopefully, thanks to some of the work that we've been doing, but other elements as well. So the key, I would talk about as compared to when we started trying to bring these issues together back in sort of 2011 or 12, there have been a number of developments which really support more integrated approaches in this area. The first would really be the Sustainable Development Goals and the adoption of an agenda that tries to look at or have a more comprehensive and holistic way of looking at very complex problems, and that promotes integration. So really, under the SDGs, for the first time, we see the development agenda and the peace-building agenda coming together. And up until then, I'm sure you've discussed in this course, there really was a great divide between the world of development and the world of peace-building, or the peace and security community. So that's really one of the first elements. We have sustainable development goals now that bring peace and development issues, peace and social issues, together. The second element is really around the very interesting and very rapid shift in the Security Council on what they on sort of the importance of climate change for both as a driver of conflict and as a result of the importance of engaging in climate change action as a peace building action. So we're really seeing an important shift in the Security Council, an area where previously there was absolutely no possibility to talk about an issue which was considered very much a development issue, like climate change. That is now shifting, and we're seeing more and more resolutions, as I'm sure has been mentioned again before, on this area. And so that's creating a much better context for us to be working in. I would say that from the gender perspective, there is still a very important gap. One of the areas that we're trying to engage in very forcefully is, in fact, in the climate and security, in the work that's happening around climate security, and making sure that gender is included, a gender perspective is included in all of that work from the beginning. There still is no specific policy that brings these issues together in a very clear way. There are mentions here or there, but that's what I think we're trending toward, and we're in a much better space now. I don't want to be too long on this, but of course there are many resolutions that have succeeded the resolution 1325, which is the mother resolution on gender, peace, and security, which didn't mention anything related to environment, natural resources, or climate change, of course, in its original iteration. I think, if I remember correctly, that resolution now has something like 7 daughters or sisters, which have gently moved towards issues related, for example, to access to land and productive resources. So those issues are discussed, and in some of the recent reporting on those resolutions, climate change, environment, and the ways in which women are impacted particularly impacted, but also some of the opportunities that are trying to come out. But I would say that's still very much an incipient field, and we're looking towards the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 next year as an opportunity to really increase the integration of these two areas.
It seems like another big trend has been kind of a shift in emphasis, or at least a broadening from women as victims or protecting women's rights, to also thinking about and providing space for women's agency.
Yeah, I would think, I mean, that's certainly the intention. I think we're still lagging behind on this. I'm particularly frustrated that in much of the literature on climate change, and in fact climate change and security, the only mention of gender is around women's vulnerability and women's special, the special impacts that this has on women and children, and consistently looking at women as one of the vulnerable groups that needs to be protected or saved, which of course is the case. But I'm quite frustrated to see that despite the fact that we have come quite far in trying to move away from that discourse, that is still the pervasive way to look at least at a first level, issues of gender, and in fact, gender, but also age, and also economic status, and also etc. So that is a frustration of mine. I do think you're right, though, that there is a general movement away. There's a general consciousness that we need to move away from that kind of discourse. And there is also an understanding, again, without wanting to get a little too much detail, but the implementation of the resolution 1325 and the whole gender, peace, and security agenda, which is in fact quite a broad and quite an innovative agenda, has been very narrow. There has been a very strong focus on two areas in these 20 years now of implementation. The first is on sexual and gender-based violence, for good reason, but is obviously one of those areas in which women are very much victims and are robbed of their agency. So in a way that perpetuates that view. The second area has been on mediation and dialogue and peacemaking. And the focus has really been on women's participation and inclusion in sort of high-level political processes. And there has been a lot of attention paid to counting how few women are still engaged in these processes, et cetera. But those two areas of focus have kind of excluded other parts of the agenda, in particular issues related to post-conflict peacebuilding, and which is where a lot of issues around economic empowerment, livelihoods, political participation more broadly, governance, which is where all of those issues come in, where there are many, many opportunities to engage women in a much more agency supporting kind of way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the areas, and I do know from my colleagues who work more specifically on the gender side that that is a recognition. There's recognition of that, and there is a lot of push to try and somehow right the ship and rebalance, which will be another opportunity again to engage in some of the work that we're doing around natural resources and climate.
It also seems like a fourth way that this landscape has changed is that we've gone from just advocating to having a lot more evidence about different ways that we can approach these priorities, that organizations are testing, innovating, and we're starting to document that.
Yeah, again, I mean, are you referring to the Sustainable Development Goals, or more broadly to?
I remember back in the early 2000s, there was a lot of just broad hand waving about women as victims. Women need to be protected. Women are but then the question, if you asked, so what do we do? There wasn't a lot of tangible recommendations. Mm-hmm. Of the need, but not knowing what to do. And now we seem to have more recommendations about what to do. And a lot of those are based on approaches that have been developed or tested in one place or another. So there's a growing body of evidence and experience.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, this is one example of the kinds of efforts that are being made I think, I mean, the key thing is that there is a lot of push now to, in the wake of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also many other areas, to try and have much more comprehensive or holistic approaches where really different partners and different organizations with different mandates and expertise come together to try and understand the issue from multiple angles at once and propose solutions that are much more concrete and well, how to say, more realistic and more that take into account all these different dimensions at once, or at least try to. I mean, I would say that without wanting to paint the program that I have the pleasure of managing in too exclusive a light, that I think there is still relatively little evidence out there of this kind of integrated programming being the norm. I think that's certainly where we're trending. But I think one of the innovations of the joint program, beyond the themes that it addresses, is around this idea that you can bring together, in our case, 4 partners that have different mandates, relatively clear mandates, very different expertise, and that you can use all of these sort of together in trying to unpack sort of some of these multidimensional, really complex problems, and coming up with solutions that try to address all of these things at once. I think we're still, and with very good reason, because there are many operational obstacles, certainly within the UN system, but I think across the international community as well. We are still very much at the incipient stage of that. There is still a lot of programming that is what we call siloed, that really looks very specifically at one area without trying to cross over very much into other areas. So I would agree that there's a trend towards this kind of approach, but I think we're still in the early stages of that. And hopefully this program, but others that do this kind of work as well, will provide a positive model that can be replicated across other, cross-cutting areas, so to speak.
We have a question from Dimitris Kantamnidis. Sorry. I understand from Ms. Halle that women, because of their gender, can be part of the solution. Is it realistic to assume that women are a homogeneous group with common problems, interests, and solutions?
Well, thank you very much. That's an excellent question, and it allows me to specify that. It's always very uncomfortable when we talk about gender or women to talk about women as a single homogeneous group. That is, of course, not what we mean in reality, and I'll be happy to provide examples of how we try to unpack those notions and try to work in what we call an intersectional way that looks not only at gender, but of course at social and economic class, at age, at ethnic background, religious background, whatever other identities a person can carry beyond gender. It's absolutely not realistic to consider that one can work with women as one homogeneous group. I don't, we would certainly not do that. In the original analysis, in the report that is at the base of the joint program, which was an initial effort at understanding some of these linkages, we did spend some time trying to look at, look at different ways of understanding how gender crosscuts other identities, and how that can lead to both participation or participation in conflict and other things, but also how gender can be used as one entry point through which to improve the sustainability of peace building efforts. So that is certainly not the intention to paint women with a single brush, even in one country or one area or one community. I think that's very clear. There are a lot of efforts now within the gender community, in particular, that have nothing to do with natural resources or conflict, to speak in a much more careful way about which women and how to understand that. So Thanks for the question. It's a very important point, and it's a shorthand to sort of continually talk about women, because it would be very complicated to continually try to sort of distinguish between various groups, etc. But certainly in the context of programming, we are very careful about that, and very aware in all of the sort of background analysis, scoping, baseline exercise, whatever happens at the beginning of a project, to very carefully understand how other forms of identity intersect with gender in ways that pose challenges, but also give us opportunities.
And I'm curious, you talk about women and gender. When one talks about women or females, there's that side. When you talk about gender, does that also include men? And if so, how does one approach that part of the gender equation or the gender analysis?
Yeah, thanks for that question as well. I mean, absolutely, gender includes men, and gender is simply the cultural, the definition of a sort of a cultural identity around that includes one's sex, but also all kinds of cultural constructs or social constructs around that initial identity. So we like to in terms of analysis, certainly, and in understanding the issue, we would tend to talk about gender because we like to understand through gender what the power relationships are in society, and gender is part of that construct. In terms of programming, our program focuses specifically on supporting women. It is born out of the Resolution 1325, which is about women, empowering women in peace-building processes. And so our program focuses specifically on targeting different kinds of women in peace-building processes, using natural resources and environment as entry points. So there's a distinction there between how we sort of analyze a situation, how we comprehend it, how we try to unpack what social relationships and power relationships are, and how men and women play into that. But then in terms of programming, we would ourselves focus more on gender, but on women. But there are programs that look more broadly at gender. There are programs that there are many programs, for example, in the peacebuilding on the peacebuilding side of things. I can't think of one now that is specifically linked to natural resources or to the environment that look at masculinities and the construction of masculinity, in particular around violence. That there are many sort of peace-building programs that try to address that linkage. But to my knowledge, nothing specifically related to natural resources and conflict.
You talked about the role of women in post-conflict peace-building, and Dimitris also had a question. He said, in the Bosnia War, there were many women who participated in fighting. Is a gender-oriented approach for post-conflict reconstruction suitable in this context?
Sure. Again, I mean, I think, the gendered approach is simply an effort to understand and analyze how issues, how specific issues or challenges affect men, women, boys, girls, all these identities differently, right? So it's really about understanding how different groups, and again, gender is only one of the identities, but how different groups were affected or participated or were somehow engaged with a particular issue or problem or situation or context. So a gendered approach is absolutely suitable for any program, really, but in particular, one that, in terms of post-conflict and reconstruction, understanding who did what the roles are, how they may have shifted during conflict. And in fact, the example of ex-combatants is a good one, because this is typically an area where programming has focused almost exclusively on male ex-combatants, or let's say on ex-combatants with the assumption that they were male. There are many examples of post-conflict programs supporting ex-combatants that were what we would call gender blind, that were not based on any form of gender analysis or gender assessment, that led to very unfortunate outcomes for women. One of these examples I could think of was in Nepal, where women, where one of the interventions that was done post-conflict was to reward, or let's say to support ex-combatants with a plot of land in the post-conflict period in order to help them, develop, help them with food security, but also hopefully develop some form of income from the cultivation and sale of products from that plot of land, etc. It was a form of sort of a form of compensation for leaving armed groups, but no attention was paid to the fact that in customary law or in customary practice in Nepal, women's right to ownership of land was very different than men's, and so women found themselves, being given the land or not, depending on the situation, and then having it taken away, or not being able to use it, or being prevented in terms of access, etc., because the legal or customary framework around access and use of land for women was very different. So, and this is really one area where many women found themselves not only suffering from the lack of access to economic opportunity as a result of that, but then also being ostracized, by their families, by the surrounding communities, etc. So it was really a very difficult situation that had to be sort of addressed as an afterthought with very mixed results. So I would say, certainly, if the question is a gender perspective or a gender approach valid even when there were women ex-combatants, I would say yes, even doubly so, in fact, because it's impossible to design effective programming or programming that provides equal opportunity to men and women ex-combatants if you don't understand what the situation is, and how women's roles, what roles women played, but also how they may have shifted, and what their opportunities are post-conflict.
Your comments lead very nicely to another question, and that's, what's the difference between policies that are gender blind and policies that are gender aware?
I think if I understand your question correctly, gender blind policies or programs, for that matter, would be policies or programs that haven't considered how the issue that they're trying to address, or the whatever they're trying to do or advocate for, how that's, how those issues are different for men, women, boys, and girls, and how simply the effect of the policy may not be the same depending on whether you're a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl, or any form of gender identity in between, mind you, which is also an area that gender studies address. But and gender awareness, there's so many terms. As you know, there's gender aware, gender sensitive, gender responsive. Gender responsive is the one we like to use, or we've tried to promote in our programming, because it feels a little bit more action-oriented than aware or sensitive. Mm-hmm. The awareness or sensitivity would imply that you've done some form of gender analysis, that you are aware that there are differences with respect to the challenges or opportunities you're trying to address, but that you're not. It doesn't have that quality of being sort of action-oriented, so you're aware, but it doesn't seem to imply that you are necessarily doing something about it. So we'd like to talk about gender responsiveness, which is really the act of responding to some of these differences and trying to address them and promote equality, and ensuring that what you're doing not only does no harm, but is actually actively empowering. And perhaps that notion of do no harm is where that awareness and sensitivity would lie, somewhere in between, where you're sufficiently aware or sensitive that your actions are not having unintended negative consequences for certain groups, but not necessarily actively engaging towards their empowerment.
This distinction, I think, is important because there are a lot of people out there who focus on rights of all people, non-discrimination. That seems to be gender blind. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female, tall or short, whatever it is, everyone has the same rights. And
yes. If I may interrupt right there, the issue is that we know that structural inequalities in society mean that that's not true. That that there's an assumption that everybody is equal, and that everybody has the same rights, and everybody certainly does. But what we call the structural inequalities in society of discriminations that happen because of one's gender, race, or other religious belonging, nationality, or whatever, regardless of whether you're sort of actively being discriminated against, that those things are pervasive, and that it's not the sort of rights framework, human rights framework around all of our programming is not sufficient to guarantee an equal environment or equal sort of outcomes for all. And this is perhaps maybe it's something that we can address. There's often in the gender world, I don't know how to say that. There are often two schools of thought, right? And one is that thanks to all of the human rights frameworks that we have adopted over the years, men and women are equal, and that's that. And because of that, women have a right to 50% of attention, programming, funding, whatever it is. And then there's the other school of thought, which are, and I'm not trying to imply that they're necessarily different or that they can't be complementary. That is in fact exactly my argument. But there is another, maybe not a school of thought, but certainly a practice which is more around making the business case for why you would address gender. Why would you actively try to empower women on a particular issue? And many people bristle at that notion that you have to make a business case for why you would focus on women or on any other form of identity. So this is one of the things we have to contend with very often. It's a reality among donors, and I'm sure that many of the participants in this course have come across this in various forms in their practice and their work. My personal position, but I think the position of our program as well and our partners, is that those things are not mutually exclusive. That the human rights framework provides precisely that, the framework, and it provides the rationale for why we need to be working towards these issues. But in all forms of programming, we need to demonstrate why we think a particular action will lead to will lead to effective projects, or effective programming will lead to positive results. It's what we call a theory of change, and that I think it's a valid point that we need to demonstrate how from point A we're going to get to a result in point B, and why engaging through this particular group of people, whether it's women in general, which it would never be, or these particular groups of women, etc., will lead to an effective result. So I think we try to do both, and certainly have everything, or everything that we do is within that fundamental framework of human rights, but still try to demonstrate that engaging women, in our case through natural resource or environmentally related interventions, is a smart thing to do, that it leads to more effective peace building, and that it's worth doing at scale. I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I just wanted to make that point because it often comes back.
Let's turn now to some of the work you've been doing on climate change and climate change, security, and women. A question from Virgilio in Cabo. What are adaptation strategies to climate change that can boost women's empowerment?
Okay, so I'll just, maybe I'll just take the example of our recent project in Sudan, because I think that helps us understand the context of, or at least one context in which climate and security are very clearly intertwined, and then look at not only the impacts on women of this situation, but also what can be done to empower them, as Virgilio says, both from a political point of view and from an economic point of view. So if you allow me, I'll just give the example of that project. So we just, as I mentioned, we just completed a pilot project in North Kordofan in Sudan, in an area, in a community called Al Rahad. This is a community that has been over the last, decades certainly, heavily impacted by environmental degradation as a result of climate change and other factors as well. There are other factors there. Increasing drought, high variability of rainfall, crops failing, et cetera, et cetera. So really a context in which local livelihoods have been under pressure for a very long time now, several decades, because of environmental degradation. And also, the reason we worked in this community is because it's a very interesting, it's a community that's at the crossroads of also pastoral roots. So the nomadic peoples who herd cattle, cattle and camels and other animals that come through, that have for centuries come through Al Rahad on their traditional migratory route, and they are also under intense pressure from a degrading environment, with less and less access to fertile grazing land, and less access to watering points. So this is a community in which we are very clearly seeing an increase in the number of violent clashes between resource user groups, so between the sedentary agricultural-based population and the nomadic groups. And this is also a context, and this is where it gets to the question of gender, where as a result of some of these pressures, the community is becoming more and more female or feminized. On the side of the sedentary farming communities, those communities are becoming more female or more female-headed because men are leaving the community for longer and longer periods of time in search for alternative work. Very often they go into mining, which is creating other security problems elsewhere, which is quite interesting. And on the side, from the point of view of the pastoralist groups, the nomadic herders, what's happening there is that because they're under more and more pressure, they are in several cases, within several groups, splitting and leaving women and children behind in that community as they continue on their traditional migratory routes. So you have a community which on both sides is increasingly headed by women who are seeing a very important increase on their economic burden to care for their families and their communities. And this is, and who are not only seeing an increased burden and more difficulty in dealing with some of these economic outcomes of the situation, but also on the front lines of the conflict that is happening. They are those who are left to face those clashes. So that was the context in which we were operating, and which really gave us, provided us with what we felt was a very strong rationale for why you would work specifically to empower women's groups and women in that space. So the project, the overall goal of the project was really to increase women's roles in the prevention and resolution of some of these natural resource-based conflicts that are happening there in this broader context of climate change. But we did this in 3 phases, which provided or tried to empower women in 3 different ways. And this is what I would like to share. So the first the first phase, or the first part of the project, was really on women's economic empowerment, trying to address some of the economic difficulties that they were experiencing as a result of this situation. It addressed the question on climate change adaptation, because we basically supported various women from various groups to develop alternative livelihoods and different forms of agriculture that they were using. From what they were using, sort of innovative forms of irrigation that were far more sustainable than what they had, etc., and basically help them, and then bringing in different crop varieties that were better adapted to the new realities on the ground, and basically supporting them to develop not only their own sort of plot agriculture, but also set up 2 cooperative farms and other elements, which really, and we saw a very significant increase in their income as a result of that. So, I mean, I'm not a specialist by any means in sort of livelihoods or what can be done to adapt agricultural practices to a dryland environment that is increasingly dry. But we thankfully had experts that helped us with that, and that was the first step of the project. And I just want to mention that I think it was an important one, because so often we have projects that come in with the intent of helping women in sort of peace building or increasing women's roles in conflict prevention, but they don't deal with what women are immediately concerned with, women and everyone else, mind you, which is degrading economic conditions and concerns over income and ability to support family and education and all of that. So the project really started with that economic empowerment component, and really did lead to some significant increases for the women who were supported. The second part, and building on that, was to try to empower women in what we would empower them politically, but at this level, this was really sort of local level governance of natural resources, and bring them into decision-making processes over sharing natural resources and conserving natural resources. And this we did through an exercise I won't go through in any detail, but what we called community environmental action planning, which is really a process by which representatives from all different groups in the community come together to jointly analyze what their main challenges are with respect to natural resources, and then prioritize or develop a priority action plan that helps them address that. And women, we didn't actually need to support them very much. They very naturally took the leadership of this exercise and really derived not only a lot of experience from leading this process, but also a lot of legitimacy within the community. They were really seen as the leaders, and many of the men that we spoke with and interviewed really recognized the potential for women's leadership through this exercise. And then the third element, which built on obviously the other two, was bringing them in much more actively into the local conflict resolution mechanisms, which have for centuries and centuries been the territory of men. Prior to this intervention, there were 2 women who were affiliated to this local peacebuilding center, as they called it, but were only brought in as mediators or as participants in the dialogue on issues relating to domestic disputes. So they were never the other issues or causes of conflict that brought members of the community to the center to try and find peaceful solutions, women were not consulted on. And I'm happy to say that through the interventions, which included training and discussions with local authorities and building sort of dialogue forums which women led that are now affiliated to the center, there were all kinds of interventions related to that. But thanks to those interventions, we now have doubled the number of women, more than doubled. I think there are 10 women now affiliated to the center. But also in the last, I think 6 mediation processes that the center has led, 4 were directly about natural resources, and women were part of all of them. So, I mean, this is very, as always with a small pilot project, the results are always anecdotal until we can scale them up. But I think that it shows the kind of potential of looking at all of these areas: economic empowerment, political empowerment in sort of governance, basic, standard governance, and then political empowerment through participation in conflict prevention and conflict resolution, how, if you look at this as a sort of a common or a full process, you can actually bring different strands of programming together in ways that add up sequentially and accumulate to a very interesting result. So I know that's a very long answer, but I was trying to provide an example of programming around this.
Thank you, Silja. You touched on a few things that I wanted to see if we could tease out. One of them is the kind of in that bundle of women and dispute resolution, and we see some kind of quantitative evidence that women's involvement in peace negotiations increases the length of the likelihood that peace will last and that it will last longer. And wondering, both in terms of at the very local level that you were describing and more at the peace negotiation side, is there something different about women's involvement? I mean, is it just that you're bringing in talented people who happen to be women, or do they have different perspective or different skills because they're women?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I think that's a really it's a very well put question. I will say that even though I think I do refer to that statistic in the lecture I was asked to do for the MOOC, which the participants will have seen, that is quite a controversial statistic. Not so much because there isn't evidence that more inclusive processes, including of women, lead to better outcomes, but because these are very, very difficult numbers to put together, that there is always some generalization, which some people don't agree with, and kind of picking and choosing your statistics. So it's a nice way to make the point that inclusion and gender inclusion are important, but I think we shouldn't be too stuck on the numbers themselves. Yeah, I think there is definitely evidence for women bringing a different perspective into peace negotiations, and I think this is where there are a few things to discuss. We know, for example, from many peace processes that in the background of the overarching peace process, or the top level peace process where the high level people are, there are always multiple sort of groups and lobbies and often sort of civil society, et cetera, pushing and supporting and helping, et cetera. And we know from many of the peace processes that we looked at that they were typically, or they were often, women's groups of all kinds, mind you, but groups that involved women who brought in issues related to natural resources and to benefit sharing from natural resources. They often seek to address or recognize that, for example, land or land reform are going to be important challenges for the peace process, not only the peace agreement, but the peace process after that to address. In some cases, they've made a big, or they've put a lot of emphasis on water and the sharing of water resources. Other times it's been issues related to benefit sharing from extractive resources. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting that women, as part of from various backgrounds, but often as part of civil society mechanisms, are the ones bringing these issues to the table when they are left out from the formal agenda. And in some cases they were successfully included, in some cases not so much. So I think there's a lot of evidence for that. There's also evidence for women bringing a lot more, well, I mean, just generally speaking, more of an inclusive perspective, and trying to bring in more, and simply more perspectives, not only the perspectives of women, but of other groups. And they tend to open up peace processes, or at least support a more diverse group of people being involved. So I think there is evidence of that, and the point that interests us is really their link, or this link that we can see to women's focus, or what is often a focus on issues related to natural resources, and then seeing this as key for the peace process. And well, I think I'll stop there and then we can continue.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to come back to something you said at the very beginning about measuring success, and wondering, this is a challenge in environmental peace building where you're trying to do, you have the environmental side, you have the peace and conflict side, now you have environment, peace and conflict, and gender. How do you measure success across all those axes?
Yeah, good question. I hope somebody can give us the answer to that. I mean, it is a great focus of the joint program. The joint program was set up to pilot and test these various approaches and strategies, and obviously try to demonstrate that they can be successful and have an impact on the sustainability and strength of peace building processes. So being able to measure success, but not only to measure success, starting with understanding what is a result in this area and what one would consider a result has been a very important sort of part of the program from the beginning. So part of the testing that we're doing on the ground and through these pilots is developing various kinds of indicators and testing which ones work, not only from the perspective of whether they allow us to show good results, but also from the perspective of what kind of data can you collect to try and to try against the indicator to try and understand if you're making progress. What even constitutes data? So are you looking at simply numbers or sort of quantitative data and numbers of women participants in various processes, or are you looking at various forms of qualitative data and in many cases innovative kinds of qualitative data? So some of the work that we're trying to do is around storytelling, for example, and video and other forms of sort of collecting information that are not typically considered, certainly in UN programming. I think there's a lot more innovative programmers out there that are doing more of this. And so it's certainly been a focus. What we would like to do is bring together a coalition of organizations. And in fact, we've started a discussion with the Peacebuilding Fund, which is the main UN multilateral fund for peace building, as you all know, because the Peacebuilding Fund is increasingly looking at, in particular, climate, but more generally, environment and conflict. And so we've started a discussion with them to try and understand whether there are ways of bringing in common all of these different efforts and developing, I hesitate to say the word standard, that feels very normative and kind of final, but developing a common set of indicators across the various organizations or across the various actors that work in this space, and see whether we can come up with a common way of understanding what constitutes progress or success or result in this space. I will say that, I mean, one of the challenges that we have, which is very, very common across everybody doing programming, are it's particularly on peace building, but on environmental issues as well, are the timelines of projects. I mean, our pilot projects are 18 months to 2 years. Measuring success in terms of social shifts, let alone environmental improvements or whatever it is, and of course peace building impacts is not possible to do over 18 months to 2 years. Anything will be sort of anecdotal. So one of the efforts we're trying to make in the joint program is to ensure that even after the end of the pilot project, we are able to go back at least one more time, and in the case of Sudan, it will be 1 year after the project closed, using the same set of indicators, but also new ones that go a bit further, and try and understand over time not only how the project, or if the project has been sustainable at all, but also how to understand some of the contributions toward the broader, the peace building impact, if you will. And I think those that's also something that we're trying to test if that's helpful, to think about monitoring and evaluation as an exercise that goes on well beyond the end of a particular intervention, where you are necessarily very hamstrung after 18 months to 2 years to say anything in terms of the longer term impact. So those are some of the things we're trying. I'll have to let you know in a couple of years' time what we've been able to do. But I think there's a lot of interest and appetite out there to definitely improve the way we measure success and have a broader understanding of what that is and what constitutes data, which is really one of the areas I'm fascinated with.
Excellent. And so to wrap up, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about, given all the different things that you do, the research, the policy, the field work, what are the most important skills or experiences that have helped you do what you do?
Yeah, as always, a good question. One of so maybe in terms of skills and experiences, what I spend most of my time doing is herding cats and trying to make the UN system sort of speak with one voice on this particular issue. We do have a very good partnership with the other organizations, but it's never easy to be at the helm of a partnership and to, motivate and incentivize partners to move ahead alongside, especially at the same time and with the same amount of input and effort. And I would say that particular skill, if I do have it, is born directly from my political experience. Some years ago, I was quite heavily involved in politics here in Geneva, where I live in Switzerland. I was an elected member of the Green Party in our municipal council of the city of Geneva, and then I left that post, which was absolutely an evening kind of activity. I left that because I was elected to the Constituent Assembly, which was the assembly that was created to redraft a new constitution for the state or the canton of Geneva. And I would say that definitely the experience of working, especially within a consensus-based system as the one we have here, and trying to form coalitions and partnerships based on common interests, often very narrow common interests across, in our case, organizational lines and across countries, etc. That's definitely the experience that I would say has helped me the most in doing this now, and also potentially the ability to see, to try and move beyond the typical silos we have in the UN system, and to try and see issues from different perspectives in terms of building interest within different constituencies for common issues. I would say that's probably the most helpful experience, but there have been others.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Silja. And thank you all for your questions and for engaging in this office hour. And with that, I think we will sign off. Thank you, Silja.
Thank you all. Thank you, Carl. And good luck with finalizing your coursework. Thanks.